Welcome to Journeys with the No Schedule Man, exploring authentic stories of personal growth and lessons learned from people living true to themselves with creativity, passion, and purpose. For all past episodes, subscribe at iTunes or visit noscheduleman.com. And please connect, share, and contribute with a comment, rating, or review. And now, here's your host, the No Schedule Man, Kevin Bulmer.
I've been known to struggle with reality, not that it is any real mystery.
The question is, are you a willing participant in your constant reinvention? It's happening to you and to your business, whether you choose to participate or not. I believe that life is a constant process of reinvention. Call it evolution or whatever you like, but impermanence is a fundamental fact of life, and yet it's something that we as humans seem to resist the most. So what kind of mindset do you have? Growth or fixed? Welcome. I'm Kevin Bulmer. We're in part 3 of 4 special edition episodes of Journeys with the No Schedule Man, as we reflect back upon the journey of this project so far and take a few moments to recognize some of the key developments along the way. As I look back, I can tell you unequivocally that no one person that I've met in recent years has had as much a positive impact on my life as Gair Maxwell. And if it weren't for this podcast, I may never have found him. I got into the fall of last year, 2016, and just going through the act of trying to find people that I thought were interesting, that had something to contribute to this show and would be valuable to anybody that listened, I came across Gair. We haven't been able to agree in terms of how I found him, and I'm not even sure if I if I know anymore, but I visited his website, gairmaxwell.com, and read about the Reinvention Chronicles and the Branding Highway and other things that Gair does. And I was really intrigued. I thought, this is a guy that I need to reach out to. But now I've reached out to a lot of people to ask them if they would be on this podcast. Sometimes I know how to get in touch with them directly. And usually when I get that, I either get a really quick response, yes or no, one way or the other, or I don't hear anything at all. Sometimes I will find somebody's website and then email through the website, like where there's a form that you can submit through that. And that's how I emailed Gair. When I do that, I'm less likely to hear back from people, has been my experience. Not Gair. I sent an email through his website, and within 10 minutes of sending it, my phone was ringing. I would soon learn about him that he's a bit of a throwback in that he actually uses phones. You know, these things, Androids, iPhones. You can actually talk to people and hear them talking to you with these devices. And I confess this is something that I had kind of lost touch with, but Gair would much rather talk for a few minutes than text, and that's something that I've really come to appreciate about him. But he was interested right from the get-go. I piqued his curiosity. What's this podcast? What's it all about? Why are you reaching out to me? I want to know more about it. By all means, let's get together. And so we did. And it's the only episode that I've ever recorded in an environment that I felt like I didn't have control over. So I've been to other people's offices, and I've done a lot of these interviews in my own office while the guest connects with me over Skype, but never in a coffee shop. So Gair and I met at a Starbucks, and he says, no, it'll be okay. We'll just get them to turn the PA music down, and no, it'll be neat. It'll be all right. And I was having anxieties about this. I thought, oh gosh, I can't control. People are going to be looking at us, but they seem to really like it and really appreciate it. And so that was October of 2016. And I can't imagine what my life would look like without having met this guy. He has become an absolutely treasured friend, a valued mentor, and an incredible contributor to my journey, both personally and professionally. And he doesn't do the work for me, but he'll give me the seed of a perspective, I think, to see if I will pursue it or not. And for a while, I was a little bit puzzled as to why Gair would keep coming back, why he would call, why he would bother to email. He's busy. We all are. But I came to learn that he appreciated that I was listening to him and acting upon the information that was being shared. And I have jokingly referred to him as Obi-Wan, which would make me Luke Skywalker, which is maybe giving me a little bit too much credit. But I'm telling you this as a means of reinforcing what I have touched on over the last 2 weeks, which is when you can honor yourself, your authentic self, doing the things that you really feel that you want to do, that you need to do, that you don't want to get to the end of your life and look back and regret that you didn't try. Even if you're not sure how, even if you're not sure why, you just feel compelled to do them. That's how this podcast has been for me. When you do that and when you act upon it, you will attract people that will help you, that will not only help you gain clarity on the why behind what you're doing, but also help you discover ways to do it better. They will introduce you to other people that will help you propel and pull you along on your journey. And they'll also help open doors to other possibilities, and turn lights on into rooms that have been previously kind of left in the dark, help you reconnect with parts of yourself. And so for me, speaking was a big part of that, and a big part of what Gair and I talked about after we did the podcast episode and the conversation that you're about to hear. We sat there at the Starbucks table, and he said, I noticed on your site that it says speaking. And I said, yeah, that's kind of a law of attraction thing. It should probably say aspiring or emerging speaker, but the kind of thing where, you call yourself what you want to be. So you live the role and then it becomes that. But he was interested in that, and he was interested in some other things that I had put also on my site, and shared some very personal things about his own path, gave me some things to think about, which I initially resisted, and he's since heard this. And I told my sweetheart Caroline about some of the things that Gair shared with me, in particular about opening up about my experience of the divorce that I went through many years ago, and how all these years later, we're all in a better frame of mind and having better relationships than we were pre-divorce. And when I say we're all, myself, my sweetheart, who I just treasure and adore, my sweet Caroline, my former wife, her new husband, all of the friends that we have that, you're told when you go through a divorce that friends choose sides and all that kind of stuff. I've proven that's just absolute baloney. That comes down to choice as well. But he pointed out to me, said that that's not the everyday experience. That's not normal. I think you should pay some attention to that. I think people need to hear more about that. And I resisted that at first. And I told Caroline about it. And the next morning, she pulled me aside and she said, so you like Gair? I said, yeah. He's been at this a long time. I said, yes. She said, you respect him? I said, yeah. She goes, do what you like. I love you and I'm going to support you either way. I just thought I would offer. I think he's right. I do think you need to share about that. And those contributions turned into what is now probably the signature keynote talk that I give, which is called Rise Like a Phoenix, Race Like a Turtle. In fact, the whole Phoenix angle of that was given to me by Gair. Not the whole name, just the seed of an idea. I think at first I was calling it Embracing Change. And he very gently suggested to me, Kev, that's just, it's not specific enough. Anyway, I could go on forever, but that, talking about all of the things that I appreciate about this guy. But that was one of the first of what we now would call between us a jam session. In fact, at the time that I'm recording this in August of 2017, just this morning we met and had a little creative collaboration, a jam session. We just, on the day I'm recording this, decided to kind of call it that. He had emailed me yesterday. Again, I'm in the time machine now. It wasn't the yesterday when you're listening to this. But so he'd emailed me and just like, hey, early morning coffee. I said, sure, where do you want to do that and when? And he said, the Starbucks at this road, and I'll text you when I get there, 6 or 6:30. I thought, all right. Went to bed, and I thought, well, if we're going to meet then, I don't have any problem with taking an hour or two because we still will get most done before most people have gone to work. And sure enough, I got a text just a little before 7 o'clock, and off we went. Spent a couple hours together and talked about reinvention as growth mindset, creativity, doing the work, that we're both really passionate about this whole idea of, agility, constantly reinventing yourself and looking at things that we now as individuals and businesses would look at and think this is always going to be the way that it is. And yet things have never changed as quickly as they do now. Or maybe they have. Maybe that's just a really trite, lazy statement. But to say things can change quickly. Ask people in the music industry, in the newspaper industry. I have just recently stepped away from the traditional radio industry. And for the big media companies, heads up, don't you see what's happening? No, I know that they don't. But in every business, you've got to look around and see what's going on and not get so stuck in your own day-to-day grind, or what I call stuck in your story, to see the greater context. Not just the forest for the trees, but the whole world around it. And to see what people are doing and how quickly things are shape-shifting. It comes down to impermanence. Nothing stays the same forever. Reinvention. You're either reinventing yourself, your choices, your mindset, your habits, your attitude, or you're a victim and life is playing you and you're trading your time to contribute to somebody else's dream. You're either growing or your mindset is fixed and you're blaming and you're positioning yourself as the victim. It's the exact same, I think, in business. And Gair is somebody who speaks to executives all over the world. You're either constantly open to reinvention, or you're basically like the ostrich. You're thinking, there, we've dotted that I, we've crossed that T, we're good. No, there is no there. Things are constantly evolving. How are you keeping up? Yeah, that's a challenge, but that's part of the fun of knowing that we always have the opportunity to grow in any event. It's reinvention. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and Gair is the guy that you want to bring out to your business or organization to talk about that, to talk about branding, to talk about being extraordinary and to differentiate yourself. Now, as far as this conversation is concerned, because I didn't know Gair at the time we had this conversation that you're about to hear, we talked about a lot of things that have not come up since. In other words, I asked him about things I probably would not ask him about now, which I'm really glad that I did, because he mentions things that I haven't heard from him in the time since we did this episode. Things like the difference between being stuck on transmit as opposed to being open to receive. That's a powerful idea. Or how the door of opportunity, that window of opportunity, doesn't blast open and pull you through. It only ever opens just a crack. He talks about that in this conversation. It's up to you of whether you want to bust that door open and walk through or not. And that, I realize now with hindsight, is one of the reasons why Gair has made time for me. He gave me just a little crack of opportunity and was curious to see if I was going to run with it. I did, and then he'd give me another, and he'd give me another. I've already described what's happened in the time since. He also talked about how it's not about the many, it's about the one. And we're stuck in this backwards idea that it has to be popular in order for it to be good. It's such a backwards idea. There are all sorts of things that are really popular that are absolute garbage. And there are all sorts of things that are of an incredible quality that haven't found their audience yet. But all of these things and more come up in this conversation with Gair Maxwell. I'm going to turn it over to him and rewind us back to October of 2016. First, just a little bit of context. Gair is an international speaker, an author, co-creator of Huggable University with Jim Gilbert and the Antarctic Method with Mike Pierce. He's a reinvention expert, speaks on the branding highway, knows purple cows in and out, how to differentiate with your business and your brand. He is the guy. To learn more about him and to find links to his website and his social media pages, visit noschedulemanpodcast.com. Look for special edition 3. It's called Reinvention of this podcast, Journeys with the No Schedule Man. Now, over to that conversation we had. I started by asking him about his dad.
Well, my dad actually is a former pro golfer. He was born 7 minutes from the first tee at St. Andrews in Scotland. So Dad was one of these child prodigies growing up on the North Sea coast and came to Canada at a very young and tender age of 17, 18 years old because someone from Scotland read about him winning a bunch of schoolboy tournaments. And then that's how he got his first job as an assistant pro at Lambton in Toronto. And he comes to Toronto in the late 50s and winds up meeting my mother, and the rest, as they say, is history, as I come along in 1961, which was, of course, the last time the Chicago Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup up until the current edition when Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane and company and Corey Crawford have helped the Hawks regain some Stanley Cup glory.
I don't know anything about that, being born in 74 and a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, so I don't even know what the Stanley Cup is.
But I'll tell you, when you ask about my dad, and I'm honored that you did, because Dad still plays not only an impeccable game, but for the longest time he was a great example of comportment on the course. Like he's the guy who's always on time, Kevin. He's the guy who's always in control of his emotions. He's a professional through and through on the fairways and on the putting greens, and I never clued in until much later in life what a great quiet example he was setting. And here he is. He's now 77 years old, and we played golf I'm trying, even though we live in different provinces, I'm trying to make every effort to go out and play at least one round with him each year. And this year, Dad bogeyed 3 par 3s, and he's 77 years old, and he finished with a 75 that day. So
wow,
that kind of tells you how he's still got game.
Well, and the reason why I did bring that up, Gair, is that I thought you did a really great job of positioning that eloquently, that relationship, but then also not just as it relates to father and son, but how those lessons that you just touched on. And there was a term that I noted when I read that, quiet example. I love that term. How that blended itself and led you into so many of the values and the ideals that are so present in your work now. I'm wondering, at what point did you identify all of those things that kind of came from your dad and his golfing that were reflective of your larger mission?
It was, to be honest, it was probably about a decade or so ago, but man, do I wish I had been paying attention a lot earlier. And
how many of us can say that?
No, really, I mean that.
Yeah.
And I can make all kinds of excuses, but the fact is, I did 20 years of broadcast journalism, and I hate to say it, I think for those 20 years, for the most part, I was on transmit and not receive. And I really believe, Kevin, that so many of us struggle with that. It's kind of like the radio dial, right? Are we on transmit or are we on receive? And I have found that, as you get older, you realize there's a lot of benefit to being on receive and really listening and paying attention to what's going on around you. So in the case of my father, it's become like crystal clear, especially these last few years, about when I look at his body of work, not only as a dad but and a golfer, but just as a human being. When I look at his body of work, I'm impressed, and I'll now spend the rest of my days trying to, struggle in some ways to live up to that, because he's, in his own quiet way, he has set a very lofty standard, and I think standards are good. I think they are good. I think they make us be aspire to be better and find something deeper within ourselves, and bring our game to the next level. Because as whether it's business, whether it's life, whether it's golf, each day you're only as good as your last day. You got to bring it to the course every time.
Absolutely. So if it was about a decade ago, as you say, that you really started to identify and integrate some of those characteristics into what you were doing, what led to that, to viewing that experience with and through your dad?
That's a great question. No one's ever asked that before, and I can share with you, and I think anyone who's in business will understand this readily, because I use this example a lot when I'm especially working with small business owners, and well, it really doesn't matter. It's companies of any size, because I grew up on a golf course. And I just want to say for the record, I mean, I'm nowhere near my dad. Anyone who thinks they're going to, be sandbagging a match with me are sadly mistaken. I'll struggle to break 100. But you got to remember, as a kid, that's what you grow up with, watching. You're hanging around the golf course. The game just becomes infused as part of your DNA. And I realized about a decade or so ago that golf and business had so many astonishing parallels, and not the least of which is, and I think this is great on a podcast because you can really see it in the mind's eye, is that the ball is either in the hole or it is not. It's very clear. It doesn't matter if it's 3 inches away or if it's a 300-yard drive. It's still, another stroke on the scorecard. And I think business is exactly the same way. A business, any company, either made a sale or it didn't. You either have a customer or you don't. And there is no wiggle room around that. You might have a prospect, you might have hope, you might have a lot of people saying, well, geez, I'm interested, but not right now. No. You either made the sale or you didn't. And if you didn't make a sale and you don't have a customer, think about it this way, on the macro level, Kevin, if you don't have a customer, do you have a business? I mean, you might have a factory producing all kinds of widgets, but who cares if there's no end user, if there's no end customer, so the golf example is one that really sets up a lot of what I teach around the idea of the very essence of business purpose. What is the purpose of a business? And, I've probably talked to over 5,000 people all over North America about that very question. And so I can, categorically state that 80% of the answers are inaccurate in terms of business purpose, because so many people will respond with, well, purpose is to make money. Well, is it really? Is making money just the purpose? Is it really the purpose of the business, or is that just the result of how a business fulfills its purpose?
Absolutely.
And so if it's not purpose and instead it is result, that's like the golf ball metaphor. It's either, it can't be both. It's got to be in or it's got to be out. And so I'm on a bit of a tangent here, but it allows me to extol the work of Theodore Levitt. So anytime anyone in business has a chance to hear a message that connects to Theodore Levitt, I'm going to take every opportunity. The guy was a Harvard business professor in 1960. He nailed it, Kevin. Nailed it. The purpose of a business in 1960. It's one of the most famous business essays ever written, and I'm astonished to this day how few people know about this guy's work. Theodore Levitt nailed it for forever and ever. The purpose of a business is one thing. It's to create and keep a customer. Boom, that's it.
Pretty simple and direct mission statement, isn't it?
But it's simple and direct, but it's actually within that simplicity, there's an awful lot of complexity.
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean,
Right.
You can take that and put that on whatever canvas that you want and instill your own values upon it, but it still comes back to that one polarizing...
Yeah, exactly. It's create and keep
Yeah.
a customer, because the real growth is in the keep. Anyone can create customers. Seinfeld had a great episode. Anyone can take a reservation. It's whether can you hold the reservation.
I saw that on your blog, and the irony is not lost on me that you and I are talking in a coffee shop. And so I am going to try to encourage you to do the opposite of every natural instinct. but that's another different story. I want to go back to your dad and the integration there in just a second, but since we got on the golf, not to go too far down that, usually I'd say rabbit hole, but we'll call it a gopher hole.
Exactly.
With the golf analogy. When I was the manager of a stock car racing track called Delaware Speedway,
Okay.
our beer rep
our Labatt rep came in one day.
Okay.
And he was, and probably still is, a golfer. I haven't had contact with him for years. And he told me about a book called Conscious Golf by a guy named Gay Hendricks. Have you ever heard of him?
I know the name. I don't know the book.
And
but
so,
yeah, I would know the name.
So Gay's a psychologist and one of my favorite people in that field. And that book has become one of the single most impactful personal development books, both just for business and life, that I've ever read. And I wish I'd thought of it. I would have brought it for you because I think you'd enjoy passing a couple hours on the airplane, where he takes that idea that you just touched on about the ball's either in the hole or out of the hole.
Yeah.
But really talks more about how it is like the game of golf, like business and life, that, the ball's just sitting there. It doesn't do anything until it gets in the way of your swing.
That's right.
Just the automatic motion of life, and then where it ends up, there is no good or bad shot. It's just the next one. You need to stay completely present in where, and so on and so forth. But a really impactful little book.
Well, and I'm glad you brought it up because I'll definitely look it up. But you just bring up the metaphor, too, that aligns with what I've learned about the whole subject of reinvention, which is 1,001% personal responsibility. See, the golfer can't blame anyone for a bad shot. Can't blame a teammate.
Yeah.
Can't blame the referee. It is the ultimate sport. And you're right, the ball's just sitting there minding its own business. So you made a decision to swing it, partner. And if you shanked it in the woods or knocked it out of bounds, that's your issue to deal with. And how often do we see that, play out in everyday life? So I think, the whole idea, I call it the principle of compete inward. You can't blame the conditions of the course. You can't blame the weather. You can't blame the economy. You can't blame the customers. How long can we string this metaphor along? But you get the point, right? Like, ultimately, we are the masters of our own fate, the captains of our own soul, and every day we get a chance to wake up, head to the first tee, and put the ball in play.
Yeah.
Just like we're doing this morning here with this fine podcast at one of the 18,000-plus Starbucks locations around the world.
Yeah, I never said thanks for the coffee, by the way, but I appreciate that. So I think we could probably do an hour just on those analogies, and that would be fun. We'll file that away for maybe another time, but I'm going to take us back to where we were. I'm still interested to know, because you've clearly thought this through and have integrated some of those, and it's not even the golf analogies that interest me so much, as your relationship with your dad and how that came to be such an integral part, and I might be overstating it, Gair, saying integral, but a part of what you're now doing. About a decade or so ago, what was the light that went on that made you think, this is something that kind of aligns with what I'm doing that I can integrate into it? What happened?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it probably, I don't know that there was any one big aha epiphany, but I can circle back to definitely where it occurred, which would have been, I go to this school every so often. It's off the beaten path. It's a 21st century business school. It's on a 30-acre campus about 20 minutes outside of Austin, Texas, and it's called Wizard Academy. And Wizard Academy has a very strange, counterintuitive curriculum that deals with cognitive neuroscience as it relates to human persuasion. It was founded by New York Times and Wall Street Journal best-selling author Roy H. Williams. So anyone listening to the podcast can look up Wizard Academy and Roy H. Williams and find all kinds of things. However, it was probably as a result of one of those first Magical Worlds communications workshops that I realized, just because of the stuff that Roy's doing in a class like that, and if I talk too much about it here on the podcast, it's going to sound a little kooky, but it's a way, fundamentally what Roy and these classes do is exercise the creative right side of the brain in terms of your imagination. And so you can't hear a record the same way anymore, or an iTunes file. You can't watch the movies the same way anymore. You can't even look at a painting the same way anymore, because it's almost like you can deconstruct what the artist was thinking and doing. And so you're it's like imagination on steroids. And so if you're asking me for where the inspiration came from, I remember after that first Magical Worlds Communications workshop, coming back with to Canada with a bunch of epiphanies, not the least of which was, golf, 18 holes. The number 18 is also the I think it's in Hebrew. I think it's both the word and the number that symbolizes life. I mean, there's all kinds of deep-seated things, and that's probably where the connection was originally made. That wait a second, I've had this resource that I've had all my life in terms of basically a lab to study human behavior, and I never really paid attention to it until now.
Isn't it amazing how we can have those parts within us, but until that light goes on, that we're not aware of it. But then once the light is shined upon that, we find that well is so deep. That it's amazing that we could carry that around and not be aware of it, and then be able to gain so much from it so far along into our journeys.
And more often than not, Kevin, it's been my, again, observation and experience that you're right. The answers are typically within. However, you benefit, whether it's a Wizard Academy or some other thing. Doesn't matter what it is. But oftentimes it's a third party. It's another person, or it's an external environment, or it's something that comes in that's foreign to your everyday life, and it suddenly makes you realize, there's more things worth paying attention to than just what's in front of me day after day after day.
Let's go back then a lot closer to the beginning. Before even getting into the broadcasting industry,
sure,
and before the Reinvention Chronicles, and long before all of that, what can you tell me as best as you can recollect about little mini Gair Maxwell running around, and what kind of a kid were you, and what did you have in mind about what you were maybe thinking that you would like to get out of life, professionally or personally?
Well, I had no doubt. I mean, I was the kid. I was that nerdy kid who collected all the hockey cards, and I knew everyone's, and I mean everyone's, name, number, statistic, hometown, what year they were drafted in. As a kid, I'm an absolute hockey nut. I didn't have great skill. I mean, I'm a purely recreational player, but I'm the kid running around playing road hockey till it's way too dark, but I'm also calling the play-by-play as I do it. And because I knew all the players.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, even today, as a kid, I was a huge Chicago Blackhawks fan, and so, the whole roster is still fresh in my mind, with Esposito in goal, and you've got Stapleton and White on defense, and you've got, of course, Makita and Hull, and people like Chico Mackey and Jim Pappin up front, which I think some of our other Starbucks customers are turning their heads because they too remember the glory days of those Chicago Blackhawk teams. But my point is, and my dad one day said, he says, you might want to do that as a job someday, calling play-by-play. So in high school, I was on this track to one day. I didn't want to do what everyone else was going to do. I didn't want the straight and narrow button-down job. I certainly didn't want to go study to be something boring like a lawyer or anything like that. I mean, I'm just talking as a kid now. And,
sure.
And so, no, I was convinced. I was headed for radio, television. I was supposed to be on the air, and so I didn't look at any other options. I was single-minded in my approach that way, which I find out much later. It's kind of odd, actually, for a kid to be in his last year of high school to know precisely where he was going. And so I did 1 year of broadcasting school at Centennial College in Toronto, and after a year, I also knew intuitively school could only teach you so much about that profession. You had to jump in with both feet into the deep end and find out for real. So got a job at a small town radio station in Sussex, New Brunswick, not too far from my hometown. And then, in those small stations, you're doing everything. You're playing records, you're reading the news, you're doing sportscasts, you're covering school boards and city council meetings and murder trials and all kinds of things. And then before you know it, you're in Red Deer, Alberta, and you're reading the news, and some guy named Ron McLean is playing records from noon until 4 on 850 CKRD. So as a kid, I hope I've answered your question. I'm that kid who had broadcasting in his blood from a pretty early age.
So you and I are similar in that respect, and also similar in that, well, I guess I'm still in that field to some extent, although albeit a different part of it. I won't pursue that tangent because I want to hear about your story. I already know mine.
Yeah.
But you've taken me into where I wanted to go, which was into the broadcast field, that you desired to be into it, and then you found yourself into it. And the journalism part of it was, although you were doing, as you say, and I've experienced that as well, you've got to do everything if you're going to be a chief dish and bottle washer especially at a small town station, although people might be surprised, especially any market, certainly in Canada, you've got to do that. But it was the journalism part of it that was always really appealing to you, was it not?
Absolutely. I mean, and I'll never forget this one book that I picked up. I'll never forget the author. Gary Paul Gates wrote a magnificent treatise, if you will, on CBS News. And I became fascinated by the stories of those guys, from Edward R. Murrow to Walter Cronkite to Dan Rather, Mike Wallace, Harry Reasoner, like the giants of CBS News. And so early on, for the better part of 3 or 4 years, I honed my chops, as it were, in the newsroom. And you acquire some. I think that's what happens to a lot of us, Kevin, in our early 20s and mid 20s. The things we pick up back then are very formative, and they stay with us. And not the least of which are those journalistic skills of just always asking the question, probing for the answer, trying to find the real story, as opposed to being just snowed and given some plastic answers from some fake politician. So from there, that was a good foundation to bring into things like sportscasting, because I didn't want to be the cheerleader all the time either of the hometown team. I wanted to be the objective sort of reporter of what was actually transpiring on and off the ice. So, that led into 1,000 games of play-by-play in the American Hockey League with affiliates of the Calgary Flames and the Winnipeg Jets and the Edmonton Oilers. And then I don't know where this all goes, but I know one thing, that no matter, even today, I mean, you don't forget those journalistic skills, but I think that's no different than a lot of people. I think in your early and mid 20s, when in your formative years, you've picked up things that are going to be with you forever. And for me, it was one of those things to always see things through the eyes of the journalist.
Sounds to me, when you started out wanting to be a play-by-play person for the Chicago Blackhawks, so thinking sports and thinking play-by-play, but then along the course of the journey acquiring such a natural curiosity for journalism. How surprised were you by that when you found that you really had an appetite for that end of it? Because they seem to be kind of different things, although when I think about it, maybe not all that much. But
I don't know that, to be honest. I don't think I've ever back then, Kevin, I didn't give it that much thought. And I look at my, I have good memories of a lot of my years in broadcasting, but at the end of the day, I've got a great friend from Texas, and he too was a fellow broadcaster. At the end of the day, we loved radio more than it loved us.
That's a long lineup of people.
But I'm not saying that to be whiny or wallow about the good old days. No, those I'm grateful for my years in that profession. But I will say, in the late 90s, I kind of started to wake up, and I saw the writing on the wall in terms of my career and where I needed to go. And so I was very fortunate. I got a few breaks along the way that propelled me into an entirely different world. And because of those breaks, I was able to take some things that a lot of people in the business world don't have. Traditional business thinkers. And I'm sure you've run into this over and over and over again, Kevin. I'm sure the people listening on the podcast. Traditional business thinking is very left-brain oriented. Let's look at the metrics. Let's look at the data. Let's look at the analytics. Let's look at the numbers. Let's crunch those numbers harder. Let's solve problems. Guess what? No one in business, and I'm being sweeping in general in my statement, very few, put it that way, stop to ponder forget the problems, focus on possibilities. What else could we do? Where could we go strategically in a place that maybe our competitors never even thought of? I think there's a real opportunity for people in business today to think less about fixating on specific problems and more about exploring possibilities and letting your imagination take over. Because I'm not just saying this as pie in the sky, because at the end of the day, I've worked with some people who've grown their business like 15x their former size just because they're willing to go down that path.
How did we get from there to here?
I have no idea.
Well,
you tell me. It's your show.
No, there's an honest answer. It sounds to me, Gair, like some of the thoughts about maybe moving on professionally and personally were already occurring to you before you had been moved on out of broadcasting.
Absolutely.
But what happened that finally made that break back at that time?
Oh, I got fired. It's pretty simple. When you get let go after 16 years of working for one employer and you're given, you're terminated in 2 sentences on company letterhead and you're given 15 minutes to leave the building, and then within a week you're on the unemployment line and you're broke and you're busted and you're a big fish in a small pond and you're hoping, really hoping no one will recognize you because you're just so traumatized. Because, to be honest, for someone who'd always worked delivering papers and working in truck stops and then I had always worked. I'd never missed a day. I had 16 years and 1 sick day. Okay. And then to suddenly be thrown into a very foreign environment called the unemployment line. I mean, maybe for some people that's just another day, but it wasn't for me. It was extremely embarrassing, humiliating. It was traumatizing. And then, I go home that day and find there's the story splashed on the front page of the only paper in a 2-station town. Not only do they boot you out, but guess what? Your nose gets rubbed in the dirt publicly. And I knew back then I was done with this. I knew it. And so I left broadcasting altogether, and I jumped in. I had been sort of exploring and looking at things, but I jumped in right into the deep end of the pool, a completely unknown ocean called soft skills business training. I hooked up with this outfit out of Mississauga, and it was an operation that kind of did Dale Carnegie type stuff. And before you know it, I'm working with small companies and business owners and their people on things like, customer service training, team building, all that soft skill stuff. And so I learned business right away in the trenches. I'm all self-taught. I was one of those guys who, because I never had an MBA or anything like that, but I had journalism skills, I just read like there's no tomorrow. I grabbed everything. So I'm churning through 100 business books a year just to and learning also the hard way of what works and what doesn't work in terms of how a business actually is able to, as we talked about earlier, create and keep customers. So I'm all self-taught that way, but the crucible was the unemployment line. That's where, and it was only years later I realized, and I mean many years later, that I realized, that stretch of time was much less about me getting let go or getting fired, and it was more about that's where real reinvention happened. And so I had to start to deconstruct the reason why, because for far too long, and I think this is important for me to share, for the better part of 15, 16 years, I never, ever talked about getting fired as openly and candidly as I am right now. I never talked about it publicly or privately because of the embarrassment and the humiliation, and so you just pretend it never happened. But about 2.5 years ago, I realized, wait a second, that's somewhat less than honest. It's highly hypocritical. It's definitely not forthcoming. And it's also letting wounded pride emerge as the winner. And I just thought, you know what? it's time to start talking about this, and because I'm never one to, I never wanted to wallow in victimhood or self-pity, but I have to now take charge, own the story, and recognize, for anyone, everyone's got their version of what I call the ultimate, undisputed, soul-crushing setback. Everyone. There isn't a person in this coffee shop that we're at today that hasn't experienced their version of the ultimate, undisputed, soul-crushing setback. For me, it was getting fired. But the point is, and this is what I've got a big keynote conference that I'm doing on the East Coast in less than a week from now, and I'll share that story with that audience of over 400 people. The point is that everyone's got their own version of getting fired, where, whether it was it could be death of a loved one, it could be divorce, illness, bankruptcy, being burned out, being told by someone or by a career that, hey, you just weren't good enough. Getting fired has become for me a metaphor, but it's a choice, and you can deny your story or you can own it. And so anyone can, in my opinion, Kevin, anyone listening right now, you can make a choice to go from getting fired to getting fired up and moving on and making things happen.
You've illustrated what I was going to point out, and it's clear for anyone that's listened to any other episodes of this podcast that what you've said I believe to be absolutely true. The phrase that I would use is getting a hole blown through you. And for me, it was divorce.
Yeah.
And the way that you described that time immediately after being separated from your employment was how I felt: embarrassment, shame, it was completely, I'm looking for the right vocabulary, Gair, because I'm wondering if you can relate. And the reason why I'm sticking us here is
sure,
because I think it sets up the transition to where you are now. It was shattering for me to understand that the people that liked me for just being Kevin. It was Kevin that thought he needed to be Kevin the business manager or the announcer or the songwriter or the husband or the homeowner, and that once these labels fell away that I wasn't worthy. And I didn't see then, I see now,
right,
that was a job only Kevin could attend to, where I was evaluating that through my own experience and just felt so small until I realized, well, wait a second, so-and-so's been through this and I don't think any less of them. So-and-so's been through this and I love and respect them. But I wasn't seeing that back as far as my own experience was concerned. And it sounds like you had your own version of that you had to go through. Once you were let go, you saw yourself in the paper, your identity or part of it is all of a sudden sort of whisked away. But tell me maybe a little bit more about that process that you started to allude to about getting into the soft skills training. But And with also in mind that, as we noted a few minutes ago, it sounds like some of the seeds of curiosity of what Gair Maxwell was going to become after the reinvention were already starting to bloom somewhat.
Yeah.
Then the crack comes. Tell me more about that transition from the firing and into the next phase.
You're a great interviewer because your instinct is correct. There was, and I can't stress this enough to anyone listening, the door opened a crack, okay? And I really believe this, that opportunity never knocks. It only ever whispers. And that door of opportunity that everyone's waiting for to swing open, that ain't ever going to happen. The door will only ever open the tiniest of crack, and a little ray of light will shine through. Question is whether or not you see it or not. And so for me, what happened was about a year before I got let go, and we parted ways with broadcasting, I was sharing my concerns with a friend of mine, and I was saying, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't really know anything. I'm not trained for anything. All I do is talk on TV or on the radio. I don't really have any skills per se, and I was just going on with, and I was being a little mopey about it, my tale of woe, and I don't, and I am not bilingual, which was important back in New Brunswick, and so she says, well, why don't you come out? She says, I'm doing this project, with small business owners who are just getting their companies off the ground. She says, I've got this contract with the Business Development Bank of Canada. We got a seminar coming up next Wednesday night. Why don't you come out, just sit in the back of the room and see what you think? And so I go to the Lion Senior Citizen Center on St. George Street in Moncton, New Brunswick. I sit in the back of the room. There's about 30 or so would-be prospective entrepreneurs, or maybe some new entrepreneurs are in that room. And there's a facilitator up there talking and doing her thing. And I'm sitting back there, Kevin, I kid you not. I had no clue what she was talking about. Not a clue. I didn't really understand the language of business per se. But as I sat back in the room that night, I was just watching her, and I was thinking to myself, I don't know what I would talk about, but I could do that. Whatever she's doing, I could actually do it. And so when my friend asked me afterwards, what do you think? That's exactly what I told her. And she said, okay, you're on. I'm on? What do you mean I'm on? She says, well, I'll give you a class. You'll have a half day, and you'll, have something to teach them. And it was the classic deer in the headlight look. Oh, my goodness, I don't know anything. And so what would I talk about? And in the spur of the moment, Kevin, I came up with the only thing I thought that I might know that might have some value to small business owners in the late 90s. And the only thing I could think of off the top of my head was, I'll teach them what to do if they're ever interviewed by a newspaper reporter or TV or radio about their business. So in other words, think of those business. So in other words, I'll teach them media skills in terms of what to do if they're on the other side of the microphone, because I had worked the other side of the fence for so long.
Sure.
And so I took a week's vacation, developed a whole program designed with a half-day schedule. I made up a little workbook. I had some examples of, interviews, media interviews gone right, media interviews gone wrong on little cassette tapes. That's how old this was, right? It sounds sort of Stone Age back in the late 90s, but that's what it was. And so I delivered that first program, and my friend turned to me and said, afterwards, because it went over very well, and my friend said, well, you don't know this yet, but she says, you could turn this into a business. And I looked at her like she had two heads, because I was so completely green and oblivious to the worlds I didn't even know the world of speaking, consulting, facilitate. I didn't know that world even existed, because I had been where was I for 20 years? Inside a bubble.
Yep.
Inside a radio booth or a TV studio. The bubble called broadcasting, where you don't really need to know anything, because you just have to be able... No, you don't. There's lots of people in the media that get by and they don't know a thing, because they just have to be able to report.
Well, the idea is that a lot of them think they know everything.
Oh, that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
But they don't. To be honest, they don't have to know anything.
And I point that out. This is something to keep in mind when you're consuming really any kind of media, including this podcast. Forgive me for hijacking.
No,
it,
it's true.
It was an
but
important thing that you pointed out.
But when you stop and think about it, in the media, what do we need to know? Well, we just have to really be able to, with some skill, report on the trials, the tribulations, the triumphs, and the tragedies of others. That's it. It's never about us. We're never on the line. That's when I realized what heroes small business owners and senior executives are, in terms of they bring it and put it on the line every day.
Yeah.
Without any glory or fanfare. They are the backbone of our economy. They get no thanks. And it's not the government who's going to solve the problems, and it's certainly not the media. It's typically going to be free enterprise and people who took the risk and put everything on the line and risked their mortgage and their families to create a business that employs others. That's basically how it works.
Yeah.
Whether anyone agrees or not is irrelevant to me, because I've seen both sides of the fence. I've been an employee for 20 years, getting paid on the 15th and 30th, nice and safe. And I've been on the other side where, for 17, 18 years now, I'm totally on my own. But more than that, I see the real heroes of the economy are the people who bet the farm on themselves to build a business that contributes to their community and the people around them.
I've felt for a long time, Gair, and I'm not speaking for anybody other than myself, but that everybody should have the opportunity to experience what it's like to be an entrepreneur, at least for a little while, and that would make you really sober really quick about a lot of things that I hear, just common complaints and everybody fighting for safety and racing to the victim position, and that's my sweeping generalization. But when the only hand that you're going to get is the one at the end of your arm, that will wake you up really, really quickly. That's
right. When you're suddenly faced with the realization that you can only eat what you kill, and you've got not only to go out somehow and kill it, but then you've got to actually take it home and take care of it and serve it and nurture it and do all those things. It's a bit of a different experience and a whole different lifestyle. Well, and so that's where you found yourself, was at the start of that new journey, and you're told this presentation that you made about how to handle yourself when you're being interviewed could be made a business, and as you described it, looked at this person with two heads. You're just starting out on, okay, I'm going to go out into the woods and see if I can get something to eat. But that's what I mean, Kevin, is that's how tiny the crack was. Yeah. It was the tiniest of cracks. I to think that sitting in the back of the room without knowing a thing could somehow offer hope. Like, that sounds a little extreme, but that's exactly how it played out. And so, but it's and you've probably seen this and experienced this, and I bet many of our listeners today have experienced it too. It's not just one thing, it's a series of these little things. And that event led to, I noticed an ad in the paper one day, and the ad was for this soft skills training organization that I mentioned that, they're no longer in business. I survived, they didn't, but that ad in the paper got me to think, well, geez, instead of just focusing on media training, maybe there's some other trainings I could deliver. Yeah. And so, because I was realizing that being inside, I'll never forget, I was invited by a friend of mine to go do some media training for the Department of the Solicitor General in the province of New Brunswick. And that was a full-day program, and I had brought a camera, and we did some mock interviews on TV type thing, on VHS tape, of course. And that was the day, that it hit me that, geez, I don't think I want to be in a booth anymore. I don't think I want to wake up at 4:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning and go and do the early morning show on radio. I don't think I want to do my TV gig a whole lot longer. Suddenly I was... Because that's, as we know, is an artificial environment. And so suddenly, for the first time, I was in a real environment with real people, and who were trying to come up with answers to slay some inner demons and dragons that they didn't know how to overcome. And I'm there to facilitate that process. And I found that very rewarding in a way that broadcasting just wasn't doing anymore. And so... That, you know what I mean, though? It's just there's this endless series of these little things that happen, and you got to make a decision. As we said earlier, you're either on transmit or receive. You're either going to pay attention to what the universe is whispering, or you're going to just drown it out because you're too busy focused on what's in front of you. Sounds to me like there's a really healthy mix of intuition mixed with action there, because for that event that you talked about being at the senior center. Absolutely. You at least got yourself there. Yep. At a low point, something inside you told you to make the decision to get your butt up off the couch and go and be there in the first place. And then after that, to be challenged with, you could do a presentation, and to be faced with I don't know how to get started. That's where, for so many of us, the wall goes up. Right there. I can't conceive of a way how, so I won't try. Yeah. And so those intuitions pop up, but as you described, those little cracks of daylight, but they don't amount to a hill of beans if you don't do anything about it. Ideas without execution are worthless. Yeah. It's just daydreaming. And then and the daydreaming eventually leads to more lies you just tell yourself. Not to wax philosophical about it, but yeah, like you won't be able to successfully reinvent any part of your business, your brand, your career, your life. If, number one, like the golfer, you don't compete inward and take full 1,001% responsibility for your actions. And number 2, if you don't conquer the lizard, it's the lizard brain. It's the reptilian part of the brain that's responsible for fight or flight, and it raises the fear monster. I can't do that for whatever reason. It's responsible for all the inner demons and the old tapes that play over and over again. And you got to decide at some point, is it real fear or imagined fear? And for the most part, the world of business and the world of career is rampant with nothing more than imagined fear, which is why you have so many companies copycatting each other in their marketing or in their processes and procedures, because they're afraid to stand out.
Yeah, and looking for somebody else to lay out the solution for
exactly.
you. And it's interesting that you were so much on the same wavelength that you mentioned golf again, because I was going to say, here we're back to where we started, in that even though it can be a beautiful day and you can just be going along fine, sooner or later you're going to end up in the bunker or in the water or in the rough.
That's a great analogy, yes.
And the only way that you're going to be able to get out is to take the next shot. And guess what? You might still be in the same place, or you might go from trouble to some other sort of trouble. But there's always going to be another next shot, right? And but it's up to you to take it. And how you got there isn't really relevant so much as where you're going. Anyway, we could continue to go on, but I'm interested in those next shots. Now you've gained a little bit more momentum.
Right.
The light has gone on. You've done a presentation. You're getting some soft skills training.
Yeah.
And then maybe you can tell me about the shots that you took to what led to ultimately, and this is a big leap, forgive me for that, but who you perceive Gair Maxwell to be today to lead into this career path that you've pursued.
Well, it's if I can boil it down, Kevin, and for the interest of the people listening and tuned in on this wonderful podcast, it's a case of I got lucky because I really found a niche that no one else was doing at the time. Certainly not near as I could tell on the East Coast, and it revolved around this word called brand. And I realized from my journalistic background that people were tossing around the word like so many manhole covers without really understanding what it meant.
Yeah. And
I started to realize what they think it means isn't what it really means. Although I didn't have the answer, but I was noticing, I could just pick it up in conversations that depending on who you asked, even the marketing people, they all had this different spin or interpretation of what a brand was and was not, and how can you actually construct something or be responsible for something if you can't even agree on definition of terms. And so I realized the world's greatest brands didn't owe their success to, it's just common sense, they don't owe their success to a logo or to a graphic design. And yet, so many people were associating that word with that element of the brand. And I realized it had to be a deeper meaning to it. And so I found this book called Brain Tattoos, and I saw the definition from Karen Post. Remember, I used to read a lot. I still read a lot, but I was really reading a lot back then when you were insecure and not knowing anything about your chosen profession. But, and you're just trying to find your way, and you're learning from other experts. And Karen Post wrote this wonderful definition. A brand is a story embedded in the mind of the market. And I thought, boom, that's it. That explains it. That's what makes Apple the same as Harvard, Harley-Davidson, Nike, Ferrari, Lululemon, the St. Andrews Golf Course, the Running Room. They're all built on stories. Every single one of them is a story-based brand. And then I had the good fortune to find a small business owner back in New Brunswick who was willing to go along for the ride and test this theory out. And his whole story changed in 2006. And he went from selling basically 10 to 12 units a month to over 100. He went from, doing about $1 million, $1.5 million in sales to over $34 million out of one location. And it didn't happen overnight, but over time, steadily, his story-based approach paid off, and it continued to pay off. Well, you have this lab where you're testing this stuff out, and you're working with some other clients where you're also testing this stuff out, and then, lo and behold, Kevin, one day you take all these observations and you put them in a book, in a real book, and imagine that. Now people start to think you're the expert because you're published in a real book. And that book was released in May of 2010, and that book opened the door to frequent invitations to speak to the world's largest CEO peer advisory group. So now, for the last 6-7 years, I've been crisscrossing North America and different parts of the world, speaking primarily to CEO groups where the audience is people who basically run $100 million, $200 million companies.
And what's that experience like?
Well, that's a whole other experience, and that's a whole other audience, as you can imagine, because they've seen, as a group, they've seen every speaker you can imagine, and they're not, because of their position and because of the fact they've, ponied up with sizable investments to be a part of these groups, they're not going to sugarcoat their feedback. In other words, if they think you're full of it, they don't mind telling you. And so it's a pretty direct environment, but the great thing about it from the point of view of a professional speaker, I always say that's the toughest audience in the world. It's called Tech Canada. TEC is the acronym for the Executive Committee. So Tech Canada and the American counterpart, Vistage International, that's the toughest audience in the world. And the only reason, because all the members will score you on your presentations, and if you don't score very high, guess what? You don't get invited back, and they don't care. But that's good, because you'll learn in a hurry whether or not you've got something to bring to the table. And so I've had the good fortune, Kevin, I think I've probably spoken to about 180 or so of those groups now these last few years, which is quite remarkable considering where I came from. Do you think for a second I ever could have imagined from the unemployment line that one day, I'm going to be on the 27th floor of an office building on Fifth Avenue in New York City speaking to a group of CEOs, and they're going to take me seriously? Like, I would have wondered, if someone asked me back then, I would have wondered, what kind of crack cocaine are you smoking? And so, but it's proof that, hey, if you listen to the whispers and you just follow your intuition and take action, guess what? Great things can happen. And you can reinvent yourself along the way in a way that basically you were supposed to be.
I'm wondering, pardon me, listening to you put it that way, Gair, makes me feel like another characteristic that we share as humans is that I don't know that we're programmed to recognize and really value a genuine and sincere human experience. And to elaborate on that a little bit more, for you to suggest, here I was at a certain point in my career when I was down, and I never would have been able to conceive that I would be teaching X to Y people, and why would they listen to me? And yet you had acquired a perspective and honed an ability to be able to communicate that could not possibly be manufactured. To put it another way, you couldn't just throw a brand logo up and say that was your brand. The only way that the stories exist is to have them lived and earned and developed, and that's where, in my opinion, when you see the logo or you hear the names, like what you mentioned, Harley Davidson, Lululemon, as soon as you say those names, ideas and stories come to mind. So Gair Maxwell became his own brand through action and ideas, and that when you come to these CEOs, I'm guessing, they respond because they probably can pick up on that sincerity of the human experience, as opposed to somebody just showing up in a suit and tie that has a piece of paper that said, I went to school and I was qualified to tell you this.
Yeah.
And so here you go. How much of that or some element of it do you feel is accurate?
That's 1,001% accurate, Kevin, because right away, it's like anything, though. I think as humans, we do have an innate sense to experience, because I, too, go and watch other speakers. I will go to seminars. I will go and further my own professional development. And just like anyone sitting in the audience, we have the innate ability as humans, beyond words, to detect, okay, who's actually been there and done it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who's walked that journey? Who actually knows what they're talking about? Let's just take the marketing world, for example. In the marketing world, there's lots of people who can go out and get a PhD, couldn't they? in the study of marketing.
Sure.
But does having a PhD convert into actually being able to demonstrate proven results in the marketplace? Like, in other words, with what you knew, was it able to help company X move from this level to a whole other level just based on your theories and ideas? I mean, that's so yes, to answer your question, I think, yeah, we can, I think humans have a pretty good BS detector, and I think that BS detector is even more alive now because of the internet, because we're being snowed under every day with so much, information that a lot of it is BS. And so it's always refreshing when you run into someone who really knows their stuff. And so people listening, for example, Dan Martell's a great friend of mine from back in Moncton, and he's turned himself into just a fantastic business coach. Okay, but he's done that because again, he doesn't have the PhD, but he's actually started and sold like 3 Silicon Valley companies. Guy knows what he's doing, and so people feed off that, and so. And I know I always find it refreshing when I run into someone like my old friend Dan Martell or anyone that you just know, hey, they've walked that journey.
What else do you have in your mind in the not too distant or maybe even distant future that you think would be a further part of your continued reinvention?
Well, we've got the book. So the book is in progress, and this is a great opportunity to actually talk about it. It's I published on my website the precursor to the book. In other words, I've been approached by a publisher out of California to complete a manuscript within the next 5 months. And so I thought one of the things that would really help accelerate this manuscript is, well, what if I put my first sort of draft out there? That's why I'm calling it a precursor to the real book.
Sure.
And at least outline what I see as the 7 principles that are evident in cracking the reinvention code. Okay? Mm-hmm. And so my hope is that readers will download the ebook, and then it will inspire them to say, wait a second, that principle, let's say principle, number 2, which is climb down, okay? That might inspire someone to say, you know what, I know someone who did that, because I want to collect real stories from real people, not celebrities, not politicians or star athletes or, the people we would perceive as having already been handed the silver spoon of advantage. Mm-hmm. I want to get the stories of real people in the book. And so the online community is already starting to respond. I'm getting the odd email here and there where people are saying, you know what, there's this guy I know that did this. So I invite anyone listening, GairMaxwell.com, ebook, download. And if you have a great idea where any of these 7 principles connected to someone you know or you've observed, and it's a real life situation, and and put it this way, Kevin, the more dramatic the reinvention, the better. Like, for instance, I can think of a few. Like, for instance, there's a guy I know he was a long-time civil servant, and he became startup entrepreneur. Well, that's a pretty remarkable shift.
It's a big leap, yeah.
It's a big leap. And so I'm looking for those stories of big leaps. And and you can probably tell I'm absolutely fascinated by the study and the process of reinvention. I believe the ability, capacity, and willingness to reinvent has become the critical business and personal development issue of our time.
I picked that up in the first time that we talked. I thought, boy, this guy's genuinely curious in me. And I picked up on that energy almost right away. And I think that for me, when I came across an awareness of you, I saw one of those little cracks of light that I thought, I need to pursue this. Okay. And then when you responded to my invitation to do this podcast as quickly as you did, and we were on the phone a week or so ago, it was like being hit with a jolt of electricity a similar kind of curiosity of what I guess I would call a genuine human experience, real story. That's why this podcast exists. That's why we're sitting here.
Right.
It's because I'm interested in a lot of the same things as you are. So any way that I can ever help or turn other people on to or contribute in any other way, count me in as a supporter and as a fan, except for that I'm going to be cheering for a different hockey team.
Yeah.
But we can still get along, right?
Well, the Leafs, the Leafs are a great study of reinvention, are they not?
There you go. Well, they're in progress, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, there's an idea for you, Kevin. You could create the whole new brand of Leaf T-shirts, reinventing since 1967,
yeah.
right?
My heart.
With their very many rebuilding programs that had varying degrees of success. No, I appreciate that, and you've already been a great help. I mean, just having this podcast, because here's the thing. You never know who's listening or watching.
Yeah.
So, for example, and you can't see this on radio or on a podcast, but I don't go anywhere. Okay, and if you just reach over there, Kevin, just reach over on the chair. Do you see there's a little black bag there, the little one?
Yeah.
Yeah, just grab the little black bag. Now, people can't see this, obviously, because we're on a podcast. But yeah, that's the one. But in the little black bag, I just want Kevin to sort of play along, and I don't go anywhere without this. And so you can probably take a picture of it.
While I'm firing the phone back up, I turned it off so I wouldn't be interrupted.
Yeah, but here it is playing out for real as part of radio play-by-play. And what do you see? I don't have the radio podcast studio at my disposal, but right at my fingertips, I do have all the equipment, and it's in a very small bag, but I've got all the equipment I need to shoot a video blog. And it's all right there. So it's a little tripod, it's a little stand, little microphone, and I can just plug that into my iPhone 6S, and before you know it, I can shoot a video blog. And I've been shooting video blogs basically since July of 2015 is when I finally started to do this after we moved from New Brunswick to London, Ontario. And so my point for sharing this is that not only did we reinvent ourselves on the home front by such a dramatic move from New Brunswick to southwestern Ontario, but this whole video blogging has been just an epiphany of insight in terms of how the reinvention process works, because suddenly now we're at this day and age where we don't really need mass media to communicate to anyone. We can be our own, in this case, Kevin's his own radio station. In my case, I guess I publish my own video, so I guess I'm my own TV station, and anyone can do this, and we live in a terrific world right now to be able to explore all kinds of things that was never possible in the 20th century. It would have been impossible. And probably the moment for me when I realized just the significance of what we were onto. I was in the United Kingdom on a speaking tour. It was in Southampton, the city where the Titanic set sail. And before the morning meeting starts, people are just gathering and showing up and having coffee and muffins. And boy, some guy, he just bolts from across the room. He sees me, and he comes straight across the room, big smile, outstretched hand. It's like, I don't know who this guy is, but boy, he knows me. And he couldn't shake my hand fast enough and talk my ear off about this video blog I had done about a month earlier from Signal Hill in St. John's, Newfoundland, as I juxtaposed the story of how Marconi invented radio and disrupted communications at the early part of the 20th century to what Netflix is doing now with Reed Hastings. And this guy was talking my ear off about this blog that I've forgotten. And I realized, oh my goodness, here's one person, but he's 5,000 miles away. Mm-hmm. We didn't need any TV trucks. We didn't need any technicians. We didn't need to pay a broadcast outlet to communicate this message. And he watched for 8.5 minutes and was quoting me lines chapter and verse verbatim. And I'm just realizing, my goodness, people are right. We're just starting to scratch the surface of how we can not only reinvent ourselves, but reinvent the way we communicate on this planet through this wonderful medium. I mean, let's face it, this podcast exists because of the internet.
Yep.
And so I guess my point to that is that we live in a day and age, and I firmly believe this, and this goes back to your thought, Kevin, about the human experience. It's not about the many, it's about the one. Now, I'll let that sink in. It's not about the many, it's about the one. Because you don't know who's listening that day or watching that day. Does that make sense?
It does, and you also don't know what's going on or what the context is of that one.
No, you don't.
Right?
So, for instance, I've got clients out in Prince Edward Island, and they're a manufacturing company, but they're very progressive, and they've been on this YouTube thing for a while. And you wouldn't expect, doing their type of manufacturing, that they would be into things like YouTube, but they've done some great YouTube videos, and some get a lot of views and some get no views, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But one of the ones that got very few views, maybe 45 views, well, guess what? One of those views was someone out of Lincoln, Nebraska, who placed a $1 million plus order for these things that are getting manufactured in Prince Edward Island. And so whether it's YouTube videos, whether it's the blogs I write in the Reinvention Chronicles, whether it's this podcast, whether it's whatever people are doing these days, I don't think it's about the many. I think it's about the one, and I think we have a chance to connect one-on-one through this magnificent technology that in a way we've just never been able to do before.
And then just keep taking the next shot, huh? And hope for
fairways
and sunny skies.
There you go. Keep stepping up to the fairway of life and business, and just grip it and rip it.
That was so great to hear that conversation back again. It was great for me. I hope you enjoyed it. To me, it feels like it could have happened a decade ago. I couldn't have had that same conversation with Gair now because I know him too well. But just maybe, one day, we'll capture one of our brainstorming sessions, what we now call our jam sessions, and share that with you. Though I can tell you, it's not for those who are of a fixed mindset. But if that's you, you're probably not still listening to this anyway. You're probably interested in growth. So I'll ask you, though, where's your focus? Possibility or problem? Reinvention or the devil you know? In other words, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results? Is it growth mindset or fixed? If you'd like more examples of reinvention, here are some good ones from previous episodes of the podcast. I'm reminded of episode 24, What It Takes to Be a Game Changer, with Michelle Dutro. Something about that episode, Michelle shares a thought about halfway through, and she was talking about reinventing herself and her business and stepping into the entrepreneurial world. And Michelle has reinvented herself several times, and she describes that in that episode, number 24. About halfway through that episode, she talks about a chat she had with herself when she was trying to decide whether to go all in as an entrepreneur or not. I've written down what she said there, word for word, and it's stuck on the wall of my bedroom beside my vision board. I read it every single day. It's at about the half-hour mark of that episode, about choosing one way or the other. You're either all in or out, but this living halfway in, halfway out, can't do it anymore. Just choosing that as of that moment, there's no more fear. That's it. This is going to work. And so that's been a transformative episode for me. And I hold it and Michelle very close to my heart because of that. Give it a listen. What It Takes to Be a Game Changer with Michelle Dutro. That's episode 24. Another terrific example of reinvention, one of Gair's dear friends, Jim Gilbert, Canada's huggable car dealer. How do you take an industry which people automatically tend to react to with some sense of aversion? Used cars. Oh, slick salespeople, right? They're going to try and take me. What do I need to do to get you in this car today? How do you take that and infuse it with warmth and genuineness of human character? Jim Gilbert has done it by constantly reinventing himself. It's episode 50, How I Got So Huggable. There is a wealth of information for you to take away from with that episode, both from a business perspective and from a personal perspective. And if you ever have the opportunity to meet Jim Gilbert, do it. Drive up to New Brunswick and visit Jim Gilbert's Wheels and Deals just for the opportunity, because the man is magical. But there again, he's just a human being, the same as you and I. But listen to that episode. How I Got So Huggable with Jim Gilbert, episode 50. Reinvention? Absolutely. Also, episode 53. How Do You Want to Be Remembered? By Melissa Shank. She has reinvented herself many different times, and she helps business people reinvent themselves and get out of their comfort zone to help grow that growth mindset again, themselves and their businesses. She's an absolute ball of positive energy, and I encourage you to listen to that. Episode 53, How Do You Want to Be Remembered? With Melissa Shank. You can find those and all other archived episodes of Journeys with the No Schedule Man on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or at noschedulemanpodcast.com. Please do take a moment to subscribe to it, share it, leave a comment, a rating, or a review. Even if you hate it, give it a thumbs down. Maybe someone will see that and go, I wonder why someone doesn't like this, and they'll listen to it. Maybe they'll hate it too. That's okay. I'd love to hear from you and to know what you think. And by the way, I'm not assuming that you'd hate it. If you did, why in the world are you still listening at this point? Anyway, if you like it, keep in mind the weekly video blog that I do. It's called Footsteps. Those are all about 3 to 4 minutes long. They're all a part of the larger journey. You can find those at youtube.com/noscheduleman or under the video blog tab at kevinbulmer.com. Noscheduleman.com will take you to the same place. While you're there, you can find the links to all my social media channels, also the sign up for my Turtle Tribe via email. You can also learn more about my speaking, workshops, seminars, and coaching there. And if you feel that any of those would be a good fit for you or your business or organization, I hope that you'll pass the word along or get in touch with me personally. Whichever way you do it, I'd love for you to join me on this journey, and please do add your voice to mine. Please do say hi. I want to thank you again for taking some time to listen and share part of your day with me. I'm grateful. I hope you'll come back next week, and please do bring friends. All are welcome as we explore more journeys with the No Schedule Man.
Just a little deja vu.